Well, good morning, everyone. How are we?
Good morning.
Good morning. Doing well? We have been talking about the tribulation period, the end times, and last week we'd taken a look at some Old Testament verses that describe that time period. Just getting a little bit of familiarity, a little bit of background before we head back to Revelation, because John's going to draw on a lot of that imagery, and we just want to have that in our repertoire before we head back there. Today, what I thought we would do, continuing on that theme, is to take a look at what's called the Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus' own teaching on the end times. His disciples asked him, what's going to happen? And Jesus sits down and he answers those questions in two chapters, Matthew 24 and 25.
So, real quick, forgive me, but why is it called the Olivet Discourse? Has anybody ever heard that before? Why is it called that?
Mount of Olives.
It was given on the Mount of Olives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Olivet Discourse. So the discourse is
The speech.
okay. So really the speech on the Mount of Olives.
Got it.
For those of us that are a little bit less educated like myself, that now makes more sense.
You've
Okay.
probably heard of the Sermon on the Mount.
Oh yeah, yep.
Olivet Discourse.
Is the same thing. Okay. So they just.
Yes, no.
That's something else.
That's something else. Never mind. Okay.
I think I'll rely on Dan. I'm just kidding.
They like talking on mountains. So that's kind of what I'd like to do today is go through the Olivet Discourse and see what Jesus had to say on the tribulation period. Also, if you've got your little maps here, we've been talking about this time here, the tribulation period, quite a bit. And the reason, again, is that from chapter 4 in Revelation to about chapter 18, so a huge chunk, a vast majority of the book of Revelation focuses on this one time period. We want to make sure we're well prepared for it. But you notice that's not the only thing that's going on here in my superbly drawn diagram. We've got three different timelines happening here. In the middle, where it says tribulation, of course, that's the earth. That's what's happening on the earth. But there's also underneath that Hades. And above it, it says the third heaven, the place of redeemed. And I realized this morning I hadn't touched on that. We've been focusing on what's been going on here on the earth. And I'd like to do at least a little bit on what's happening right now and what will be happening in the end times in both heaven and in Hades, or hell, as we commonly refer to it as. So I don't know we'll have time to get in that today, but that's on my agenda. And then hopefully at some point we'll be back in Revelation. We'll see. We'll see. All right. So if you haven't already done so, would you please turn to Matthew chapter 24. I'd asked that you read through that a week or two ago. I'd assigned that as homework, if you will. I want us to get familiar with it because I've got a few questions as we read through here. My goal is just kind of to read through the chapter 24. And like I said, I've got a few questions, but I know there's going to be more. So if you did read through it over the week, you probably got some questions, and you're not the only one. So stop me as we read through here. Okay. Something intrigues you, or you have a question, or you think someone else might, just stop and say, can we talk about this? And I'll be doing the same thing. So in Matthew 24, would somebody like to start with verse 1? And let's see what the Olivet Discourse is all about.
Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you that not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down."
And of course, we mentioned before, that was actually fulfilled. Does anyone remember who tore down the temple?
My cliff note here says General Titus's soldiers.
And the who was what nation? What nation was responsible for that?
Romans.
The Romans did, and that was in the year 70. So Jesus is talking here in the 30s sometime, and about 40 years after, the Romans fulfilled that prophecy. They tear it down, and I've told you the story before, they set it on fire. Well, there was a lot of gold plating, a lot of gilding that was done in the temple, and when it caught fire, that gold melted, the molten gold ran through the cracks, and the soldiers, of course, not paid a whole lot, they wanted that gold, so how did they get to it? They literally took the temple apart brick by brick to get to the gold that had melted and run into those cracks. And it was a literal fulfillment. Jesus said, not one stone will be on another. And that actually did happen in the year 70 by the Romans under Titus.
As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains."
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I'd like to make a little list here. What did we just say? What were some of the things in there I could put up on the board? Signs of the end?
Wars and rumors of wars.
People claiming to be the Christ.
Anybody remember David Koresh?
Oh, yeah. Waco, right? Is that Waco?
Yeah. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom.
And then famines and earthquakes.
I'm going to put nation against nation in with the wars, I think. Anything else in there?
Not until we get to the next verse.
Okay. And it says that these are the beginning of birth pains. What does that mean?
Something else is coming.
It gets worse. It gets worse. It's not stopping till
We
it
should ask the ladies that question.
Nothing stops it. Nothing.
So this isn't the end of the world. These are the things that say that the end of the world is coming. It's around the corner. Okay. And I was curious. I don't know if anyone else had this question, because I look at these lists and what am I thinking?
That's
You know, we've wars, check. False messiahs, check. Famines, earthquakes, check. So
Has there been a time in history that that's not been?
yeah. So my question is, how is this a sign? Because haven't we always had those things?
Yeah. So I had the same question. Maybe the 2,000 years have been birth pains.
Is it just that it's going to get worse and more predominant? Like,
It says that all these are the beginning of birth pains, so I think it's just saying, yeah, there's more coming.
And didn't, I mean,
It's going to get worse, yeah.
could it be like saying the birth pains began at the fall? Like sin entered the world
Yeah.
and the birth pains began. That there would be, that was the beginning, but there will be an end.
That certainly could.
And that's kind of the hope too, like that there is an end, there will be an
When they do, he does say in verse 5, "For many will come in my name." It doesn't say some or a few, many, so that would indicate over a period of number of years if there's going to be many that come in his name.
I don't have any definitive answer here. I kind of lean towards the idea of, I'll put a question mark here just to indicate uncertainty, intensification. That these things have always been true, but in some way, as we get closer and closer to the end, it's going to snowball. It's going to be greater and greater. For instance, in the last century, we had 2 world wars in addition to how many little conflicts, and just genocides and all kinds of things. Does that mean those are the signs of the end? I don't know. Well, let's read on. Let's see what else we've got here.
Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other and deceive many people.
Okay, so we've got persecution and hatred. And again, these are obviously things that are already happening to Christians and have since the very beginning. Perhaps as we get close to the end, like I said, there might be an intensification. I'm speculating here, but that's kind of how I interpret that. It's going to get worse.
Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as testimony to all nations, then the end will come.
Love will grow cold. What else was there in there?
Many will turn away from the faith, false prophets. prophets.
There'll be deliverance for whoever endures.
The version I'm reading talks about lawlessness will multiply, and love of many will grow cold. Have you got that one?
Got that one.
What's apostasy?
It depends who you ask. Most would define it as a moving away from the faith, a falling away.
Jehovah's Witnesses like these
They like it, it's a lot of words.
The message says it will be dog eat dog, everyone at each other's throats, everyone hating each other. So we should probably put that up there. Dog eat dog.
Sounds like our Congress.
So Dan, there's one part on here,
Moving away.
and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as testimony to all nations. So it sounds like there's a Christian victory there right at the end.
Well, at least everybody's.
Everybody will hear,
Yeah.
not that everybody will accept.
Right, but that, I mean, obviously, we're all not dead. If, then all of a sudden, we'll go out and we'll preach it to all the nations. And then once everybody knows about it, then there's the end.
I would say that we'll preach it.
Could somebody read, please? And just keep your finger here, we'll be right back, but Romans 10:18. Romans 10:18, this is Paul writing. He has something, I think, that might tie in with that I'd like us to think about.
But I asked, did they not hear? Of course they did. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world.
Over there too.
So that's not much context.
Where was,
It's talking about not all the Israelites.
So
You're
this-
right, I'm sorry, I should have backed up a little bit. Let me start back in verse 14. You're right, I should have done more context on that. Paul's writing about Israel. Paul, of course, being a Jew, his entire life he was torn up that while he had eventually come to faith after persecuting the church, the nation itself hadn't, and he mourned for his native people, and it was a theme throughout his writings. And he says here, starting in verse 14, speaking of Israel, but how can they, that is Israel, how can they call on him they've not believed in? And how can they believe without hearing about him? And how can they hear without a preacher? And how can they preach unless they're sent, talking about the gospel here, as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who announce the gospel of good things. But all did not obey the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes to the message about Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Yes, they did. And now what does it say after that? Their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the inhabited world. We read in Matthew that one of the signs of the end would be the gospel has to be preached to all the nations. Paul says it already has.
As of that time.
At that time. And most commentators will point out on the day of Pentecost that was fulfilled when all of the people heard the disciples preaching and proclaiming the gospel in their own tongues was a fulfillment of that, and that's how Paul was able to say that.
So I have a question. From that Romans, there's a reference in my version to Psalm 19:4. And in Psalm 19:4 it says, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world.
That's the verse that Paul was quoting from.
Right, but then there's a little note here that says in the Septuagint, Jerome and Syriac, the Hebrew meaning is measuring line. But then maybe is that voice, I don't know, maybe that's not accurate.
what if you look at the context of that, because I was back at that too, Scott, if you look at the context of that, it's talking about how creation declares the glory of God. And so when because I thought, well, who is their message? Or Like, who is there referring to? Like, is that referring to all Christians or all believers? Like,
okay.
but it's referring to, like, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims the work of his hand. Day after day, they pour out speech. Night after night, they communicate knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words, their voice is not heard. The message has gone out to all the earth, and the words to the ends of the world. So it's basically saying, like, creation has pointed to the existence of Christ, that he exists, or that God exists.
And I feel like that argument's kind of been made in here before, that you can look around in the world and see God in everything that's been created. So it's impossible to deny God when you see him in his creation.
Any other thoughts? All right. And if you come up with something, just shout it out. Verse 15, somebody like to pick up back there in Matthew 24, verse 15.
So when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house, and a man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For at that time there will be great tribulation, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again. Unless those days were limited, no one would survive. But those days will be limited because of the elect.
Okay, let's just pause there for a second. That's a good chunk. Questions there? Thoughts?
Verse 19 was, woe to the pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. At first you're thinking, well, why? But then if you couple it with the verses before, because when they're saying, like, don't go back and get your things, like, so if my baby's asleep, don't go get, like, what? I don't know, what are they?
That kind of sounds like Sodom and Gomorrah to me,
Yeah.
where if you, the Lord's judgment is coming, and you just need to get out of there. But you're going to leave behind all the comforts that you've been used to. And I feel like with pregnant women and nursing mothers, they're in the most vulnerable position out of a community. So,
You who are parents know how difficult it is here in 20th century America. Can you imagine what it's going to be like then?
If you flee with nothing.
Where are you going to flee to, though? I mean, this says, who are in Judea, flee to the mountains, but where? I understand you'll want to flee, but is there going to be any place safe?
Is this talking just about like the 44,000 Jews, or is this more than that?
I would say that it's probably going to be the entire Jewish nation. There are a lot of people who take exception with what I'm about to say. I'm going to say it anyway because that's what I do. A lot of people will read the church into Israel. You'll hear things like the church is the new Israel. I can't substantiate that from Scripture. Some people believe that they can. What we're reading here doesn't apply to the church. The church is raptured at this point. This is Israel. And you'll notice as we continue reading through here, there's going to be a definite Jewish flavor. Matthew doesn't mention this, but if we look at the Olivet Discourse as it's related in some of the other Gospels, Luke, for instance, I'm just going to read one verse there in Luke 21. You can stay where you're at, or you can flip over with me. But Luke 21, they add a verse that is not in Matthew's. Most of it's the same. But in Luke 21:20, when it talks about those in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those inside the city must leave it, and those in the country must not enter it. In verse 20 it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. We're going to talk more about that when we get to Armageddon. That Jerusalem, God is not done, apparently, with either the Jewish nation or their capital. There's a fascination around surrounding Jerusalem that extends throughout the end times. We're going to see that as a common theme in God's plan. And so what we're reading about here in the Olivet Discourse is specifically for those people who are in the land of Israel. It doesn't talk about what the Gentiles should be doing. I don't have any answer for that. But what we are reading here specifically is for those people in Judea. As it says in verse 16, then those in Judea must flee. So where does that leave people who aren't in Judea? The Bible doesn't seem to address that question.
So I know we're in Matthew and not Luke, but in Luke further down, it talks about, I moved away from it, but until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. I didn't see that reference in Matthew.
No. The passages are parallel, but each one gives a little more detail than the other one does. So I probably should be looking at all three of them, but I didn't, and that's my fault. The time of the Gentiles, we're going to see, and I'm getting a little bit ahead here, but as we go through the tribulation period, we're going to see that the Antichrist starts it off by, does anyone remember? Maybe I should ask instead of telling, to be the teaching technique there. Does anyone remember what starts off the tribulation? There's one event that kicks off the last 7 years on earth.
It's the lawless one signing the peace treaty in the Temple of Jerusalem.
And the Antichrist is going to sign a peace treaty, and that's right, and it's going to start a 7-year period that we call the tribulation. Halfway through, he's going to break the treaty, and he's going to set up what Daniel calls an abomination that causes desolation. We can't be entirely certain what that means. My best guess is it's going to be an idol. We studied during the Greek times, a Greek by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a foreshadowing of the Antichrist, who did exactly that. He set up a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies and sacrificed a pig, which of course was a forbidden animal, as a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist will do. We'll talk more about that when we get to Revelation. There's an image that the Antichrist is said to set up that speaks, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. That period of time is known as the time of the nations, or the time of the Gentiles, because they will have desecrated the temple, and they will be the ones in charge of it, not the Jews. So that was a lengthy answer, but again, we will hopefully get to flesh these things out a little more. That's just a little sneak peek. The Gentiles will take control of the temple grounds.
Dan, if the time is limited, or these days are limited because of the elect, like the last sentence in verse 22, but if the elect is not here, then why is that time limited?
Why would the elect not be here?
Because you said that this was happening, that we would not be here.
After the rapture.
So
I said the church wouldn't be here. Isn't that the elect?
Jews are
Yeah.
The Jews are the elect. They are
Got
God's
it.
people.
Got it.
I would go even
Okay,
more
I
general.
took that to mean faithful believers, like
I would just say the elect are those that God's chosen. And there's a huge disagreement on what that means, and you'll hear words like Calvin and Arminian tossed around.
Yeah.
I'm just going to leave it here at they're God's chosen. How they're chosen is a discussion for another day. They're God's chosen people. Yeah, that does include us, we're chosen. There were Jews that were chosen in the Old Testament. Is there any reason to believe in the future God won't continue to choose people after the church is gone?
Okay. So it could possibly mean people who have turned to Christ after the rapture.
And there will be. We know at least there's 144,000 that Amy referenced earlier who are Jewish people, and presumably more beyond that as well,
Okay.
who will also be elect. Anything else? All right, let's keep going. We've got a few minutes here.
that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. That's a good chunk to digest, I think. What I'd like to do with the few minutes we have left is stop the reading there and just spend some time kind of going over what Ben just read. Questions, comments?
Is there a correlation between when Christ was crucified, it became dark, and this darkness? It's just kind of a coincidence, it seems like.
I would say it is a correlation that darkness does seem to be something that God pairs with judgment. That when a massive judgment is going on, like in Egypt, like at the cross, like the tribulation, and in Revelation we'll see even more darkness. That those two things go hand in hand: God's judgment and darkness seem to.
What's going on with the carcass?
Yeah, that's like a left turn.
I agree. I'm kind of reading through here, and then I get to, what is that, verse 28, and I'm thinking, well, how does that fit in? I've got lots of commentaries that attempt to answer that question, but to be honest with you, I don't particularly like any of them. So I'm just going to say I don't know what it means, to be perfectly frank with you. Any thoughts out there? I mean, I can share some of the...
This is what is left after the rapture, so the earth at that point will be basically a carcass, right?
There's going to be a tremendous amount of carnage during the tribulation period, yes.
So all the church is raptured, so this is just what's left. The earth is basically left as a carcass, and vultures always gather around a carcass. So then the false prophets, false Christs, would be the vultures, right? It's just making a comparison to...
No, that could certainly be.
Or all the people that are left are dead spiritually, and so they're basically dead. So all the false prophets then would be gathering around the dead people. I mean, they're still alive, but...
That's another good explanation. I have one last question for you. Can Jesus come back today?
For the rapture, sure.
So there's got to be one in every class, doesn't it?
He can do whatever he wants.
As long as it's not against his word.
That's right, but I'm sure he could. Our understanding of his word probably is so limited compared to what it really means that I go with he could do whatever he wants, because we could, agreed, he can't violate his word, but I think
We could have totally
messed up something.
The reason I ask, in verse 29, here's another one of those things that caught my attention. In verse 29, and this is something you're going to have to answer whether, pre, post, or amillennial that you decide to go with whatever framework you're using. In verse 29, it says, immediately, what?
After the tribulation.
Immediately after the tribulation. And then going down to verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn. and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with his power and glory. So it links Christ's second coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, when in relationship to the tribulation.
Afterwards.
So if the tribulation hasn't occurred yet, then can Jesus come today? And that's a question that a lot of frameworks struggle to answer. Ben gave the answer away. Thank you, Ben, for that. Because you know there's so many verses in the Bible that
Can you
seem to
repeat your
indicate.
answer?
Yeah, Jesus can come back today for the rapture, but he can't come back for the judgment.
There's so many verses that seem to indicate Jesus can come back at any time. That you know that all the verses about coming like a thief in the night. But this verse says he can't come back until the tribulation. You're like, well, how do those mesh? How can we blend those together in a way that honors God's word? One of the reasons I like the framework that I'm using is because it sees Jesus coming back in two stages. One, the rapture for his church, which could happen today. Jesus could come back today for the church. But he cannot come back for what we call the glorious appearing, his coming at the end of the tribulation, until those events have occurred.
If you're using your model.
With this model, the first stage can happen any time. The second stage of him coming back in power and glory to judge the nations can't happen until after the tribulation. The other viewpoints see it as one event. The two are entwined as one. They see the rapture and the second coming as a single event. To my mind, it's very difficult then to answer the question, how do you reconcile those verses? So,
And the PCC's position would be what you just described there, where they merge the two, is that correct?
that would be correct, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, but then those that are dead in Christ wouldn't be, they would have to endure it. Or those who are alive in Christ would have to endure the tribulation. But he says we won't even be here for it. He says, I will keep you from that hour. So I don't understand how.
Well, and the main point here is, because there's no way we can possibly know 100%
Right.
for certain, the main point is Jesus is coming back, and he's going to win, and we want to make sure that we're right with him, period. I think we all would agree on that, right? And we could probably take the most accurate human interpretation and application of that. And this is one of the things I'm looking forward to seeing, where things that I thought about God or thought about the Word or how I interpreted it, I can't wait to sit in heaven and learn how way far off I was on certain things. Just no different than our kids now, raising them. We'll let them be way out there on some things because we're seeing them learn. And I can't help but think it's the same way with us and God, that there's some things that we're just out there and God's patient with us. It's our learning. It's to me, that's exciting, but I'm not as intelligent as you are when it comes to that stuff.
Anybody else have anything to share before we close?
I thought it was interesting that it says the nations will see the Son of Man and then they will mourn. So I guess is that just the realization we were wrong?
I would love to see that.
But it's sad because they're not going to change
And there's a question
You mean
too.
see him coming back or see the people
Well, there's
realize?
the earthly part of me, like this ISIS right now. I would love to see Jesus come back and then ISIS people mourn. Earthly part of me. I'd be sad for their souls, but the revenge spirit in me, like, haha, sucker. You know what I mean? And that's not. That's not a pure heart.
Last week too, we had all, how we, just what you're expressing, we all talked about that, about how we want justice, but we also want redemption for them.
Right. And God's got a justice too. We're made in his image, so we're going to naturally desire that. And we're going to naturally desire that justice.
We can pick up on that. There's some I'd like to go into on the issue. For those of you who did read Matthew 24 this week, I thank you. We had a really nice discussion, and that's possible because we have these questions in advance, and we come in wanting to talk about them. I would encourage you this week to find the time, please, to finish, if you've not already done so, reading Matthew 24 and 25. We will hopefully finish off the Olivet Discourse next week. And I'll tell you right now, especially in Matthew 24, there's going to be questions. There's some tough stuff here. So it helps me a great deal, and again, I'm very appreciative. When you sit down and read in advance, it makes things go a lot better, and we have some really good discussions. So thank you for doing that. It is appreciated. Would anyone like to close us in prayer?